Presidential elections happen all over the world, but France has its own unique way of doing things.
While there's always some suspense about who's going to end up in the Élysée Palace, there are some very specific rules about getting there.
Join us for this French Connections Plus, where we take a closer look at the protocol governing the presidential election.
The French presidential race for dummies.
Here in France, the president is elected by direct universal suffrage, so directly by the people. There's no electoral college like there is in the States.
Voting in France is not mandatory the way it is, say, in Belgium, and it's relatively easy. You have to be a French citizen, at least 18 years old, not banned from voting for legal reasons, and you have to be registered to vote on an electoral list, usually where you live.
Just like most other elections in France, the French presidential election takes place in 2 rounds, usually 2 weeks apart, and voting always happens on a Sunday.
If no single candidate gets an absolute majority in round 1, so 50% of the vote plus 1 vote, then a second round is held between the 2 finalists, and whoever gets the majority becomes the president of France.
The 2-round system is seen as a safeguard of French democracy, a safety net to prevent demagogues and populists from sweeping to power.
And in French, there's actually an expression that in the first round, you vote with your heart for the candidate you really believe in, the candidate you want to make a statement with. But in the second round, you vote with your head for the candidate you find the most reasonable, or at least the least bad of the 2 candidates.
Here's a closer look at how Election Day voting actually works.
Like most democratic elections, voting is secret in France. In general, it's done using paper and manual counting. Mail-in voting is not allowed, but you can have someone cast your ballot for you. Voting in France is like a well-choreographed dance. You show up at your polling station. On a table are pre-printed ballots with the names of all the candidates and envelopes. Once your ID has been checked, you take at least 2 ballots into an isolation booth with a curtain called an isoloir. For your vote to count, you have to put just 1 ballot in the envelope. Nothing can be written on the paper, and the paper can't be damaged, otherwise your vote will be void. After election officials have verified your right to vote, you slip your envelope into the ballot box. Traditionally, one of the officials loudly says a ceremonial formula, à voter. It's official. You've accomplished your civic duty. Votes are counted as soon as the polling station closes, which can be 6, 7, or 8 p.m. depending on the location. Ballots are counted by volunteer voters in the presence of polling station officials as well as candidate representatives who have a right to observe the whole voting process. Same goes for regular voters. It's a system designed to be as transparent as possible.
If voting in France is strictly regulated, so is the presidential campaign, starting with campaign financing.
Well, running for president is very expensive. You have to hire a team, zigzag across the country, organize pricey campaign rallies. It really adds up.
It's nothing compared to the billions of dollars spent, for example, in the race to the White House. In France, campaign spending is regulated with strictly enforced spending caps.
Well, candidates can't splash out more than 16.8 million euros each in round 1, and those who make it to round 2 must not spend more than 22.5 million euros. Spending over these ceilings is simply illegal.
There's a financial incentive to following the guidelines as well. If they stay within the limits, the state reimburses part of their campaign spending.
But how much all depends on what percentage of the vote they get.
Candidates running for president have their eye on the top prize, of course, but also on the percentage of the vote they get. It's all about getting 5%. It can be costly and embarrassing if you don't. Candidates who obtain less than 5% of the vote in the first round get up to 800,000 euros back from the state. Those who make the 5% cut get up to 8 million euros. So there's a lot of pressure to reach that 5% threshold. As for candidates who make it to round 2, the state pays them back just under half of their campaign expenses, so about 10 million euros. This system grants politicians a certain amount of independence. They're not enslaved to special interest groups or super PACs as they are in the US. But they don't get all their money from the state. While big candidates rely heavily on contributions from their political party, smaller candidates often rely on an army of volunteers. Just listen to right-wing candidate Nicolas Dupont-Aignan when he was running the first time back in 2012.
Sans bénévoles, on ne pourrait pas fonctionner parce qu'on n'a pas les moyens financiers des autres. Donc, vous savez, quand on a moins d'argent, on est souvent beaucoup plus malin. Et quand on n'a pas d'argent, on a des idées.
On top of volunteers, smaller candidates also depend on donations from individuals, which are limited to 4,600 euros per person, who can get a tax rebate. Nathalie Arthaud is also running for the third time. During her first run in 2012, she spoke about the challenges of running as a smaller candidate.
Les partis ouvriers, c'est justement pour les partis qui ne peuvent pas compter sur les valises qui viennent d'Afrique ou sur les rétrocommissions. Non, pour tout ce qu'on fait, il faut avoir de l'argent. Eh bien, cet obstacle-là, on peut surmonter par l'engagement collectif.
Donations can also land candidates in hot water. Former President Nicolas Sarkozy is facing legal trouble over allegations he received money from the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi for his first run in 2007. Candidates can also borrow money, but that too can lead to trouble. Marine Le Pen, for instance, faced backlash after borrowing millions from banks in Russia. After the election, a national commission meticulously combs through the candidates' spending, and they can refuse to reimburse certain expenses. In 2017, the commission refused to pay back Marine Le Pen for bug spray following a visit to French Guiana, and Emmanuel Macron for a voice coach. It is taxpayer money, after all.
One thing political candidates don't have to spend a fortune on are commercials. That's because all political campaign ads, whether it's on radio, television, or just about any media, are banned.
Only a small number of statements by each candidate can be broadcast, but they have to follow strict rules when it comes to time and editing.
France has a very egalitarian view when it comes to candidates' access to mass media. By law, all candidates are given equal airtime on radio and television during the official campaign period, the 5 weeks before the first round.
If an anchor for a public or a private channel interviews a big candidate during prime time, well, they have to interview the smaller candidates during prime time for the same amount of time, even if they're only polling at about 1%.
Airwave time and exposure is carefully monitored and enforced by a special state audiovisual watchdog.
The institution in charge of policing presidential candidates' access to mass media is called the ARCOM, l'Autorité de régulation de la communication audiovisuelle et numérique, but people still tend to call it by its old acronym, le CSA. During the presidential campaign, it hires a group of people to basically watch TV around the clock and log the seconds each candidate talks, this is called temps de parole, speech time, and the seconds each candidate is talked about by, say, an anchor. This is called temps d'antenne, airtime. It's a very precise exercise.
Là, par exemple, c'était donc un journaliste qui s'exprimait pour parler de différents candidats, c'est donc du temps journalistique. Tout à l'heure, dans les 4 vérités, j'avais Nathalie Arthaud. Nathalie Arthaud, c'est donc du temps de parole, directement, puisque c'est elle qui parle en son nom en tant que candidate. Si c'était un soutien, d'ailleurs, ce serait également du temps de parole.
So how does it work if a president is running for re-election? When the president speaks as head of state about French, European, or international matters, it doesn't count. But when they're wearing their candidate cap, the clock is on. TV and radio stations keep their own tally and have to report it to the ARCOM. If they don't follow the rules, they can get slapped on the wrist or worse, face sanctions. Here at France 24, our sister French channel is obliged to follow this strict tally while we get a little bit more wiggle room on the English side. There are rules about broadcasting balance in many European countries. Why is the French system so particular? Well, some argue it has to do with the nature of the French presidency.
L'exception française est très simple. Elle tient au fait que la France est le seul pays européen où l'élection du président de la République au suffrage universel direct ait une telle importance. C'est véritablement le seul cas où le président est à la fois chef de l'État, chef de l'exécutif et, si possible, chef de la majorité. Donc, il y a une exception politique avant une exception juridique, institutionnelle et donc une exception médiatique.
The highly egalitarian system has its critics, though, who say it weakens the political debate. They say with so many smaller candidates hogging airtime, important issues get watered down. Others say the system is archaic and out of touch with modern politics, so much of which happens online. Though members of the state watchdog have begged to differ.
Il y a, pour le suivi de la campagne, je pense, une forte attention de la part des citoyens français sur ce qui se passe à la télévision et à la radio. Bien sûr, ils regardent le net, ils s'amusent sur les réseaux sociaux, ils échangent, mais quand il s'agit de faire du sérieux, c'est à la télé et à la radio que ça se passe.
Moreover, defenders of the system say it guarantees political pluralism, which is one of the key ingredients of democracy.
Many of you had questions about the French election, like Ricky J. Mark, who wanted to know about the difference in impact between presidential polling in France as compared to the United States.
Well, just like we've seen in recent elections in the United States or even the Brexit referendum, polls aren't always indicative of the final result, and that is certainly a trend we've seen here in France. Keep in mind that in France, there is a period known as the silence électoral, the electoral silence, that starts at midnight the day before the election.
In that final run-up, polls or any kind of campaigning are completely banned, and the media is also banned from making any kind of prediction of a potential winner, and this until the last polling station closes at 8 p.m. on Election Day.
And that is when the result comes out. The idea is to give voters a silent moment of reflection while they make up their minds.
Next, Fuzzy Road wanted to know if running for president in France is any easier than running for office in America.
Hi, Fuzzy. Well, running for office is a marathon in any country, but it's arguably easier here in France because at just 5 weeks, the official campaign is relatively shorter and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg.
The system has its critics, though, who say its budget rules are outdated and its rules about the media are completely out of step with today's modern world where so much happens online.
But its defenders say that thanks to its egalitarian rules on spending and exposure, voters have access to a wide range of ideas and candidates, and all this ultimately leads to the rejuvenation of democracy.
Well, that wraps it up for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget you can tweet your own questions at Villeminot or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for another episode of French Connections Plus.